I guess we'll get started. My name is Bruce Barnes. I was a librarian here for 30 years, and I also was a student here. Graduated from UMass Dartmouth. It was called Southeastern Mass University at the time in 1973. So I'm very, very familiar with the campus. It actually was being built as I was going to school here. The only buildings that were on site in 1969, when I was a freshman, was the Group 2 building, which is the building we're going to walk by in a few minutes, and Group 1, which is kind of the prototype building for all the buildings on campus. So I saw everything else being built. So it's an interesting story. There's two parts of the story. I'll just briefly mention the fact that the state of Massachusetts and the Boston politicians were not interested in having this school be established. They fought tooth and nail for it not to be built. And even when it was started, after the Group 1 building, they said, we don't like this design. Why don't we just build brick buildings here? Anyway, I'll talk a little bit about that as we go along. Thank God we didn't go in that direction. Anyway, now just a little bit about Paul Rudolph before we go to the first site. Rudolph was a very, very important architect in the country at the time he designed this building. He was one of the top modernist architects designing in this. He was very well known. It was a coup, really, that we got him to do this building. Actually, he was never actually the architect of record for the project. He was hired by Desmond and Lord, a very well-connected Boston architectural firm, and they hired him to do the job. Lucky for us. I mean, a lot of people hate the design and hate what it looks like and so forth. But before we get started, I want to just mention that every single detail in a Rudolph building was thought about. There was no small detail that he didn't think was meaningful. That was one of his famous terms, meaningful. Everything had to be meaningful in a building. Someone just asked me recently, what's the purpose of these low columns here and so forth? When we get into some of the other buildings, it was to make the building smaller, to make you feel almost claustrophobic and work and gather people together. That was his idea. Because most of these are at least 7 or 8 feet, but they look like it's smaller. When we go into Group 1, the hallways in Group 1 actually look quite crowded. And that was in his mind, that was to make people interact, have the more opportunity to interact quickly. So there's so many details I'll cover, but just bear in mind, when you see something, just say, why do you do it this way? Don't be afraid to ask, because I ended up meeting many of the architects that worked on these projects over the years, and they were very helpful in telling me, well, we did it this way because he wanted it this way, but this is the reason why he wanted it this way. So if you have anything, you see something, you say, why did he do it this way? Don't be afraid to ask, because there was no detail that he didn't consider and add in his projects. For architectural historians and architectural designers, this campus is famous for its plan, its overall plan, its master plan. What Rudolph did was he was inspired by Thomas Jefferson's University of Virginia. Not that the design is the same, but he was inspired by Jefferson's University of Virginia, the original buildings, because it was a master plan. It was a combination of student and faculty. It's a beautiful place, actually, if you've been there. It has a dome building at the end of the long mall, and he saw that as very, very interesting as an inspiration for how he was going to create the campus here. Now, the great luxury he had of designing here was there was nothing here. He had an absolutely blank canvas. He didn't have to figure out any other buildings to try to match to. He didn't have to worry about that. If anybody's been to his building at Yale University, the Art and Architecture building, really his most famous building, you realize it's plugged in the middle of a space that he was given that has very little context to the rest of the buildings at Yale in that particular location. But here he had a wide open, 600 acres on this site. It was purchased by the state for $1.6 million in 1960 to develop this campus. And so the master plan, he went all out on it. And what it is, it's a big giant swirl. Starts here, swirls around towards the campanile, and then swirls around towards, there's a pond. He called it, if you read his own writings about this, wrote about the campus a lot. He called it the lake, but it's called Citadel Pond now. And that was going to be the end of the swirl was the pond. And he developed all the buildings around the big swirl. And if you'd see it from above in some of his master plan drawings, it's pretty cool actually. It's quite cool. And that was the plan. All the buildings were going to be part of the edge of the swirl. And the center here was never going to, in his view, was never going to change. This was the most important open space at the college, and this wasn't going to change. And thank God, really hasn't changed over the years. I mean, they've made a lot of decisions about where they were going to put buildings, dorms and so forth. All the dorms were supposed to be outside of Ring Road at one time, but as it turns out, the water table outside of Ring Road is like 2 feet below the surface, so they had to start building dorms inside Ring Road because of that. But nonetheless, they made the idea was to keep this clear, keep this walking space, green space. He was very interested in those types of things. And so when we get down there, you'll be able to see how it swirls around. It's a big giant field. You can't see the pond anymore because there's trees in the way, and probably can almost never see the pond from the campus center, which is another building we're going to go into in a little while. But nonetheless, that was the major issue and his major accomplishment here, really, to architects and designers, was how he managed the space, because it's a huge space to manage. And he managed to put all these buildings here. Most of the buildings that were built here were done from 1966 to 1972. In his lifetime, in his time on the job, actually, as I mentioned in a minute, he was fired after this building was built because he wasn't popular with the politicians and the people who were funding the place and so forth. That's another story that I'll talk about in a minute. Anyway, that's kind of one of the major parts of the campus is the overall master plan. Still admired to this day. Before we go inside, we're going to be inside pretty much for the next few minutes. One of the last buildings that were built that he designed on campus was called Dion. It's those 4 bays that you can see where it says Dion. That's where it begins. He designed that in the 1980s. Another architectural firm was hired for the job, and they hired Rudolph as their consultant, and he designed the building. And it's a nice building. It's like the others, pretty much. Extends towards almost the front of the campus. But at the very beginning of the campus, at the entrance, he had designed a great fountain. It was going to go like a big giant waterway, and the water was going to spill over like a sheet into a pond. And you can actually see where the pond was going to go because it's outlined by the walkways. That was going to be a pond at one time. And he designed water features for every single building on campus, and none of them were built. None of them were built. The state auditors or whatever overseeing would scratch him out every single time. But when this house hit, he had hopes that water feature would be done, because they saw the preliminary drawings, and he put the water in blue. Said this is the pond. He makes an emphasis like we're going to put this one in, but it was never put in. But it would have been a beautiful feature right out front. I mean, it would have been curb appeal all over the place for if they ever thought about things like that for retention and recruitment and so forth, because it would have been so awesome to have it that spot, and that's why he designed it there. But anyway, those types of things never made it into any of the plans, into the final construction parts of the campus. These are classroom spaces. This is the first building built on campus. Started in 1964 and finished in June of 1966. When it was opened, there was great fanfare and so forth about the building. It was so unusual. Finally, we had a building here that was going to house students in the next following fall. But it was controversial because of its style, and Rudolph started to clash with the politicians about the style and its continuation for the other buildings, and the governor decided that they would fire him, and they did fire him. But that didn't mean it was over. He had a strong group of people that were working for Desmond and Lord that said, we'll do everything we can to continue the design of the rest of the campus. as long as we can get the funding and so forth. And that's exactly what happened. He continued to secretly consult with the architects for the next 5 years, and that's how the rest of these buildings were built on that thing. He figured, as long as I can get the first group of buildings that would maintain the courtyard or the center green space. After that, he always knew it was going to be other architects who would take over and build the new buildings and so forth. But as long as the original buildings maintained the center and the cohesion that he had designed, he'd be fine. And that's exactly how it worked out. Now, this is the first area where where you have this feeling of almost claustrophobia. He purposely lowered these walls to get people to think about things. This concrete is not real tactile like the concrete at the A&A at Yale is, but nonetheless, it is very rough, and that was part of its texture. Make everybody deal with what was going on. The smaller spaces would get people, in his mind, to maybe communicate more while they're waiting for classes and so forth and so on. Now, originally the floor was rough concrete with stone on it. I don't know when they did that. It's just like outside, just like the walkways outside. That's what the floors were in here. This is another example. We're not going to go up to the faculty offices, but the faculty offices are so tightly packed into a small space. The hallways are very small. Again, Rudolph's way of saying he wanted them to communicate, to be in contact with each other and so forth. So it's even worse up there, in fact. Now, he did another job exactly the same time he was designing this at Colgate University. It was an art building. Looks very similar to the style, not detail-wise, but it was poured concrete, reinforced concrete building, very similar to this, used brick rather than actual concrete throughout. And the spaces in their faculty areas and in the hallways is even worse than this, in the sense of compressing people. I don't even think that's up to code anymore at Colgate, actually, because the spaces are so small. Now, the thing that I was working here for a long time, I went to school here, I knew a lot of details about it. I was always interested in history, so I felt good about how much I knew about the campus. But in around 2000, they started to fill in. Let me just show you what I'm talking about here. The classrooms aren't very big, but they had like a tiered theater. We're going to see how they looked like at one time. They had this theater-like arrangement. And they started to fill in so there was just one level. And I said, boy, if they start doing that everywhere, that would be I thought that would be a bad thing. And so I said, I need to document, what it used to look like, because what it used to look like is important. The auditorium is a spectacular building, actually. In addition to the main floor, there are 3 lecture halls above. And in the original plan, and there's a stage, as you could see, and in the original plan, there was another lecture hall in the back. It was going to be a theater in room. Spectacular building, actually, in concept. The presentation drawing, which we have in the library for this building, is just beautiful. It's a piece of art. And unfortunately, because of costs again, they lopped off the which is often referred to as the 5th lecture hall in the back. So when you come from the parking lot, like parking lot 5 or 4 or 5 or 6, towards this building, you'll see a big blank space. You'll say, boy, that doesn't look like something he would design. And it wasn't something he designed. But they took off, saved money again for the back lecture hall. So it would have been a theater in the round, which would have been pretty cool, actually. Campus was started. The trustees decided to establish a separate building authority, so they could build their own buildings without interference from the state, kind of. And so that's how this is the campus center, and that's how this was built. And because they didn't have to go through the state for the bidding, they hired Rudolph back. This is his only building on campus that he is totally responsible for. He's the architect of record on the campus center. Now, it was started in 1968. He did some nice drawings of this particular building, but I don't think he spent a lot of time on it, actually. But his one idea was that you would see straight down the mall to the pond. Unfortunately, there's trees in the way, so you can't see the pond anymore. But that's why we have these tiers. So no matter where you were, and the other thing, they blocked the view anyway. But that was the idea. You'd be able to see the pond no matter where you sat in the campus center when you were having something to eat, and you could see right down towards the pond. Now, I guess if you can see that building way back there, there's a house that's on the other side of the pond. If they took the trees out that's on that little rise, you could probably see some of the water. It's called Citadel Pond. It's a pretty big pond, actually. He always refers to it as a lake, but it's just a large pond, really. Nice pond. Anyway, that's the idea here. As I said, he was onto other projects, really. He did some nice drawings, concept drawings for the other architects to take over and do, but it's not as ornate and well thought out in the sense of his design for the other buildings is concerned than some of the others. But nonetheless, it's a nice building, very airy. This is a heavily used building. It's the commuter cafeteria, actually. The dining rooms for the resident students are across the way, and even the new dorms have their own separate dining rooms now. But this is kind of the commuter campus dining area, and it's because of its location, it's heavily used by staff as well as by the commuters. All right, the campanile, right here. It's the axis of the swirl. This is the center of the campus in plan. Everything comes this way. This is the center of the turn, and then it goes all the way down to the pond. Now, originally, there's great presentation drawings early on when he was contemplating what and he did some nice, beautiful drawings of the buildings, how they would look. There was a bell tower here, a monolithic bell tower with a couple of sections cut out here and there for bells to be in there. And it would be, it was very attractive. And the government said, we don't design and build the bell towers on campuses. So Rudolph and the architects went back to the drawing board and they said, well, how about a telecommunications tower? All right, you can do that. We'll let you do that. And so that's what was built. Now, for a while, this was one of the tallest poured in place concrete structures in the world. Now this was built in 1970, 1 year. And I remember the very odd way this was built. It was all this green here was a sea of mud that year. It was just a mud. They had wood walkways all through here because it was nothing but mud from all over here. All these buildings were being built at the time. The administration building had just been finished. These were under early construction. The auditorium was under early construction. The library was early construction. There was nothing finished except the administration building and groups 1 and 2. So as this went up, they had a little building built around it. And as they poured a section, a 20-foot section, you can see that 20-foot sections, 225 feet tall, something like that. They would raise this thing, and they had cement trucks with these big giant booms, which were pumping the cement into this building somehow, and pouring the items. They were poured in place. All those sections were poured in place. So the engineer. So they worried about its long-term viability because it's tall, not very, and thin and so forth, reinforced concrete, but nonetheless. And they came up with this, and the engineer who came up with this idea was at the symposium that we had on Rudolph in 2005. He came, and he was the one who suggested, just cut the edges off so the wind will blow through. And that's what keeps this from blowing over and heavy storms, because we've had plenty of storms since 1970 that could have blown this thing down, but it still stands. There's a circular stairway in there. I've never been up there. You could never get me up there, actually, even if it was there. Every once I walk my dogs here still to this day on campus, almost daily, most times. And every once in a while, they change the light at the top of that thing. And there's a guy who climbs the ladder up there and changes the light. I can't even watch him when he's doing it. I can't even watch him when he's doing it. I have to turn my head down. It scares me so much. I said, you could give me $5 million and I wouldn't even go halfway up. Actually, Rudolph went up there when they were doing that building out front that I was talking about with the water feature, and took pictures of the campus from up there. He took a picture through one of the slats, actually. And one of our photographers went up there as well, Manny Pereira. Everybody remembers, Carrie remembers him, Manny, I'm sure. He went up there a couple times, took some pictures. Right now, it's very restricted because it's nothing but a raven and crow roost up there. And I guess it gets pretty slippery, you know. But anyway, every once in a while, somebody goes up there, changes the light bulbs, and it's kind of scary when it happens. There was when I was doing, again, when we had the symposium, a lady who lived right across from the campus came, and her father was one of the supervisors of the concrete pouring, and he had written a handwritten note of how it came about. It was very, very interesting. Basically, they just poured into forms, lifted the forms up in this house that I don't know how the housing lifted itself, but it did somehow, because you could see it every week or so. It would go up another section and so forth until they were finished at the top. And we found an exact description of how it was built. Pretty cool, actually. Now, as you can see, it has all the cell phone and Wi-Fi towers and so forth on that thing. He used to, I guess every once in a while they have some music, not music, but they bring the time and so forth. It doesn't happen all the time, but that's about the only thing it does as far as function and usefulness for the students is concerned. That's what I have to say today.